It is finally here. It is the eve of the 2024 presidential election, and that means that I am going to predict for the last time Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, all 50 states, the electoral map. The stakes have never been higher. I'm putting it all on the line today. Let's talk about this map. Now, before I get into the states we're going to be filling out, of which we'll be doing all of them, no toss-ups, we're going to pick a winner in every state. I will just remind you, and this isn't this is just for background, maybe for those of you who are new to the channel or who don't know this. In 2020, I did this prediction of the 2020 election, and I called 49 of 50 states correctly. I had Donald Trump winning Georgia. He ended up narrowly losing it. Beyond that, I was right in all 49 states, plus obviously the District of Columbia and the congressional districts. So I've over the past 4 or 5 years, over the course of the past 4 to 5 years, excuse me, I've gotten a pretty good feel for this. I had a good 2022. I only missed one Senate race. I had a pretty good house map. So if you're new to the channel, I hope you're going to sit through this and listen to my reasoning. With that being said, we all know it's going to happen. So let's begin, shall we? As we always do, we're going to fill in the safe Democratic states first, and none of these are going to change or have changed since my last prediction. What you're going to see is that Harris is going to start out with a slight advantage over Donald Trump in terms of the safe states, but it's going to come down to the big 7 swing states. Now, there is one state, or should I say district, that is actually moving out of the safe Trump column in light of recent events. Also, I don't know, I forgot to characterize Vermont. But there is going to be one district that's going to be moving out of the safe column for Trump in light of, some recent events. And that is going to be Nebraska's first congressional district, not the second one, which we'll be getting into in just a moment here, but that first congressional district, because the polls have had it relatively close. Obviously, I don't think this district is too competitive, but the polls have had it somewhat close. We've had, mid to high single digit margins. Trump won this district by 11 points in 2020, but it trended left. And in 2022, in that special election in June of 2022, Democrats, and they contested it, they came within 5 points of winning it. So I think it's to be close to an 8 or 9 point victory for Trump, but it is left trending, and I fully expect this seat to move towards Kamala Harris, just given the trends. It's also a district that you'd expect to be more pro-choice leaning. We also saw that Seltzer poll out of Iowa, which we talked about in literally just 1 second. I promise. That Seltzer poll, if it's anywhere close to being right, that means that these Plains regions that are normally Republican leaning, like Nebraska's first district, could be moving a bit towards the Democrats this year. So that's going to go in the likely column. I did just want to get that out of the way, though. We're now going to be filling out our likely Democratic states. Now, these are going to be the same ones as normal, and I forgot Colorado to be safe, but that's okay. New Mexico, Virginia, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Maine. I don't have too much to say about any of these states. I think these are all at this point pretty clear, likely Democratic states. Virginia's gotten some attention from the Trump camp in recent weeks because of some close polling. But again, I do want to clear this up. I do not expect Virginia to be particularly close. Kamala Harris leads by 6 points. She's at around 50% of the vote. In the high-quality polls, you look at the higher quality polls, they show good margins for her. Wason Center, this is a poll that was dead accurate in 2020. Harris is up by 11. YouGov has her up by 9. She's up by 10 in the Roanoke poll. And then even the GOP poll from Quantus Insights, they can't find a lead for Trump. I think Harris could win it by a few points less than Biden in 2020, but I doubt it will be within 5. That is all I have to say about these states. Again, if you want a specific review of a specific state and you comment it down, I will do my best to respond to you before election night, but none of these should be all that controversial. And of course, I forgot Nebraska's 2nd district, because what is a video I make if I don't forget to characterize a district on time? So Nebraska's 2nd district, Biden won it by 6 points in 2020, rapidly left trending. The polls there, just to show you, how left trending it is. Even the polls are picking up on movement towards Kamala Harris in a very meaningful way. If we take a look at the 2nd congressional district, she's up in every poll. In the best pollsters like New York Times, Siena, they have her up by 12. I don't think this one's going to be all that close when it comes down to it. So let's now get into the likely Republican states. We'll be starting off in Alaska, which I do actually want to talk about for a few minutes here before we move on to some other states. Alaska is really interesting because it is left trending. Democrats are contesting a House seat there, which they didn't really do in 2020, obviously because they have an incumbent in Mary Peltola. And notably, this is what we have to understand about Alaska. There are a lot of pro-choice voters here, which is why I think in part 2022, Democrats held that House seat. It's a pro-choice state, very libertarian. You got a lot of, people who've historically voted Republican who I think are at risk of defecting away from Trump this year. With that being said, it's a red state. Trump won it by 10 points in 2020, and Kamala Harris hasn't really invested in it too much. I think long-term Democrats have good prospects here. For now, I'm going to pick Trump to win it. And again, you'll see my final margins at the end of the video in all these states. So just to fill a few more likely Republican states, obviously Kansas is there. Maine 2nd District is going to be there. Voted for Trump by 6 points in 2020. Going to be similar this time. Now, let's go to Ohio, which I do briefly want to talk about. We've gotten a few close polls, but on average, I think it's pretty clear where Ohio's headed this year. In 2020 and 2016, Trump won it by 8 points. We did get a good poll for Harris from UMiami a few days ago. Let's see. Maybe they didn't add it. It looks like it hasn't been added. Oh, here it is. Yeah. The UMiami local poll had Trump only up by 3. But beyond that, other polls have showed it not so close. Emerson, Morning Consult, they have Trump up by 11 and 9. Trafalgar notably only has Trump up by 6, which I think isn't that great for him. But at the same time, Ohio is a hard state to poll. At the end of the day, the polling consistency is pretty clear. I expect Trump to win it by 8 or 9 points like he did in 2020. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, Iowa. And I didn't think I'd be saying that a few weeks ago, but Ann Selzer, the best pollster in the country, came out and I think dropped the most shocking poll of the cycle by far. She had Kamala Harris up by 3 in this state. And that is stunning. I mean, in 2016 and 2020, she got the margin right down to the point. Or actually, 2020, she was off by about 1. But she predicted a Trump decisive victory in this state twice when all the other polls had it close. In 2022, she got the Senate race right exactly. We saw similar things in 2012 and 2018 and all the other mid-election cycles. She has been excellent. There's reason that she's considered the gold standard. But here's what's interesting. She has Harris up by 3, and no one else expected that. So what are my thoughts on this poll? Well, first of all, if you're betting against Ann Selzer, and you've been doing that for the past 15 years, you would not have a lot of money left because Ann Selzer is right almost all the time. The only race she's been wrong about since 2008 was the 2018 governorship, but she only had it as a 2-point race in favor of the Democrats. So this year what's interesting is that she's predicting, or her poll has Harris ahead in Iowa. Now, I don't believe that, and that's because the other polls, show pretty consistent Trump leads. And of course, notably, and this is what's really interesting, I do expect Trump to actually hold up in Iowa this year. Harris hasn't really contested it, unlike 2020 where Biden did go there. And another thing to note is that Democrats have really, really fell in the Midwest since 2012, since Obama won Iowa for the last time, right? So I don't believe that this one poll is going to trump all that, but it makes me very, very concerned that Selzer is so much more. Her final poll is so off from the consensus. I'm going to stick with the consensus. I think Selzer's going to be wrong this year, but I say that with a lot of humility because Selzer is very rarely wrong. Now, the one thing I do want to say that's good for Harris, because I don't want to completely ignore this poll, if it is even close to being right, Harris will win the election. Now, why is that? Iowa usually votes 10% to the left of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, usually 12% to the left of Michigan. And so let's just say, even if you don't believe Harris is up by 3 in Iowa right now, let's say she's down by 5. Even if that's true, she'd be winning Wisconsin by 5, winning Michigan by 7, right? Because Iowa is so much more conservative in these states. So if Iowa's actually, doesn't even matter if Harris is winning it, if it's close, remotely close, Trump is in a lot of trouble. That's the significance of this poll. But with that being said, I'm still going to pick him to win Iowa. So with that, let's get into our lean Democratic state. This is where things get interesting. Now, I do only have one lean Democratic state here, and I think I'm moving Michigan from the tilt to the lean column. Michigan's been getting very good for Harris in the final weeks of the campaign. Again, I do genuinely believe that this is the best of the big 7 swing states we've been talking about. And again, what's notable here is that Harris's lead has dwindled a little bit in the polls. That's mostly because Republican pollsters have come in, right? Trafalgar, Patriot Polling, Insider Advantage, Atlas Intel, these are all GOP-aligned firms. And then, Atlas Intel, again, they've been, releasing polls literally every other day. But first of all, Trafalgar has a narrow Trump lead, which, again, they had Trump winning in 2020, and that didn't pan out, right? But if you look at the nonpartisan polls, Emerson, which has actually been pretty bearish on Democrats all cycle, even they have Harris ahead. And then look at New York Times Siena in their likely voter screen where they pushed undecideds. They had a tied race, And then Mitchell Communications obviously had Trump ahead. Or had Harris ahead, And then notably, I think some of the better local polls, like first of all, Marist is an excellent pollster that I really like. They have Harris up by 3, and then Glengarriff Group. If I can, let's see if I can find it here. Glengarriff. Maybe I can't. Maybe I'm not gonna be able to find Glengarriff, but they're a local pollster. And anyways, they had Trump up in the summer. They now have a 2-point Harris lead. On top of that, early vote data is looking good for Democrats. We're going to start talking about that as we get into the truly competitive states. Ann Arbor, which is where University of Michigan is, it's the most progressive part of the state. Turnout is way up. And most notably, this is what gives me, I think, most confidence in my pick of Harris to win Michigan, is that we got a report from Winfrey, who is the who I think chairs the Wayne County Board of Elections, or as a ranking position within Detroit. She is able to predict turnout very well. In 2022, she said it would be down a little bit from 2018, which was correct in the end. In 2020, she predicted turnout very well. This year, she says turnout is going to be even higher than 2020, and that is significant because Biden won Michigan by 3 points in 2020, and he got a decent turnout at Detroit. Obviously, it could have been higher, but it was pretty good. So what does that mean? Going to be difficult for Trump to win Michigan if Detroit's turning out at the rate that people are expecting it to. The polls move towards Harris, and at this point, I do believe that in these swing states, these marginal states, the ground game starts to matter. The Harris campaign, especially in the Rust Belt, is a significantly better ground game, get out the vote effort than the Trump campaign. So with that being said, let's get into our lean Republican states. I'm going to give 2 at this point. So the first is going to be Texas. The second is going to be Florida. Now, Florida's a bit of an exception because in terms of margin, and I do predict these broadly by margin, but just in terms of a margin here, this will be likely. I'm going to have Trump winning it by, I think, 7 or 8 points at the end of the day. Now, here's what I will say. Florida is weird. I could see this race coming down to a 2 or 3 point race. I could also see it going Trump plus 10. I'm putting it in lean out of an abundance of caution because I want to recognize the fact that this is hard to predict. We saw Republicans jump out to a massive early vote lead, only for Democrats to kind of cut into that in the final week of the campaign here as early voting came to a close. And again, we've also noted that in Florida, Democrats have been polling okay. I think it's time we talk about the impact of potentially the Puerto Rico comment at the Madison Square Garden rally for Trump. The majority of Hispanics polled, I think by NBC, I think 70% almost said that they found it more offensive than funny, and I don't believe that comments like that can sway elections unless they're horrible. And even then, I'm not condoning that comment, right? I didn't think that joke was particularly funny, and there's a reason it bombed in the crowd, right? Here's what I will say. Elections are polarized, and I do genuinely believe it's hard for comments, even like that one, to sway elections. That being said, we've seen Florida's willing to move in the final weeks of the campaign, and blowouts tend to materialize late. They don't materialize early. They materialize in the final month. That's happened in 2022, and in 2020, Trump, I thought, was losing Florida for most of the cycle, and then by November, I was pretty sure he was going to win it. Obviously, I predicted that in my final prediction. So Florida's a hard state. I'd be shocked if Harris wins it, but I think the margin is going to vary, and that's the point I want to drive home here with that. Let's now go to Texas, though, because Texas, I do think, is a bit more certain than Florida. In the polls, it's pretty consistent. Harris is down by 6 or 7 points here, actually down by 8 now. The lead is expanded for Trump, which is good for him. And the high-quality pollsters show good signs for Trump. Again, New York Times Siena, Trump in their likely voter undecided push, he leads by 10 points. Morning Consult, he's up by 7. He's up by 8 in Signal, which is a GOP firm, but still. Then the best polls Harris has gotten, I think, were the Trump plus 4 from YouGov and the Trump plus 7 from Emerson College, which Emerson, again, has been very bearish on Democrats all cycle. So the fact that they have Texas within 7 is good for Harris. Here's what I think. I think the polls are going to miss in her direction. I don't expect her to win it, obviously, but she's down by almost 8 points right now. I think she'll lose by 4.5 or 5 points. Texas is left trending. We saw in 2020 that there were a number of areas where Joe Biden improved significantly over Hillary Clinton. And then what we also saw was that in 2022, even as Democrats struggled statewide, they actually were able to hold on to that ground locally. Compared to, when I say locally, I mean on the gubernatorial level. They held on to their ground in 2022 and improved from 2018, even though 2018 was a bluer year. So the trends in Texas are clear. Not going to be enough for Harris to win the state, but I do think she's going to kind of hold that ground like Democrats did in 2022 and not get blown out as the polls are predicting. So with that being said, we've got toss-ups. I have 6 toss-ups on this map. Michigan, the Big 7 swing states, I think Michigan's the easiest to predict. The rest of these 6 are toss-ups. So once we get into the toss-ups here, once I move them off the board in the final prediction, I'm going to do them in terms of how likely the winner is to win it. So essentially, we're just looking at which is the least close. And I believe that right now, the least close toss-up, if I had to pick, not saying any of these aren't very close, is North Carolina, which is going to go for Donald Trump. Now, I do want to pull out the 2020 election map at this point. So if we take a look at this election result in North Carolina, Trump won by 1.3%. Now, Joe Biden could have won this state if he had got better turnout from the more rural black counties up here and better turnout from the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg. He could have won the state. The problem that Democrats have, though, is that A, we don't have any reason to believe that black turnout is going to be high enough for them to win. Again, black turnout could be good in North Carolina. They can still lose, as kind of happened in 2016. And B, the suburbs, the Republicans held up well here in 2020, especially compared to neighboring Georgia and Virginia. Look at Cabarrus County outside of Charlotte. Trump still won that county. And I think the margin could thin this year, but I think Republicans still have some sort of fundamental strength in North Carolina suburbs that they don't have in other states. And then obviously talking about the rural, more Appalachian part of North Carolina, Trump has room to grow there. These counties, I think, can and will trend right. So that's all to say that, look, Harris can definitely win North Carolina, but at this point, I see her as the underdog here. And then just, kind of go to the polling conversation. The polls have had this close all cycle, but there's no denying that Trump has the momentum here. Again, we actually saw Harris had some narrow leads in the summer and in the September. It's now up to a 1-point Trump lead. The one thing giving me pause here, the one thing that made me move this back in the tilt column away from the lean column was that New York Times Siena had Harris up by 2, but the other polls, they show, pretty solid leads for Trump. He's up by 1 in Emerson. Morning Consult has him up by 2. I saw Redfield had him up by 1. YouGov, they had some pretty good polls for Harris nationally, but they still had Trump up by 1. And then East Carolina University, which has actually released this morning, they had Trump up by 2, and they're I think the best local pollster in the state. It's going to be close. I think it's going to be similar to 2020, but Trump is the favorite at this point. And again, Democrats haven't won a federal race here since 2008. So maybe it happens tomorrow, but I guess it's still kind of that I'll believe it when I see factor. Now, with that being said, the most important state is Pennsylvania. And I think right now Kamala Harris is favorite there. So that gets her to 260. So if she wins one of these 3 states, she's the president. But let's talk about Pennsylvania now. Pennsylvania, early vote, Democrats have a firewall of around 410,000 with some mail ballots outstanding. What does that mean? Roughly, if we assume that Harris wins the same amount of Republicans as Trump does Democrats, we're looking at Democrats entering election day with Harris lead entering election day with a 410,000 vote lead plus independents. Now, independents in Pennsylvania, we've got around 170,000 ballots from independents, and we obviously don't know how they're going to break. Now, in 2020, the exit poll suggested that Biden won independents by a good amount, and I believe that will happen again. We saw in 2022 that persuasion, which is essentially the political term for like how independents vote in competitive elections, Democrats won that big. That's why they won in states like Nevada and Arizona and Georgia, despite having a not a very big turnout advantage. Actually, in Nevada and Georgia specifically, the electorates were actually a lot redder than 2020, but Democrats won by more because they won a lot more independent voters. I think a lot of that comes from Dobbs. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that Trump is now less popular than he was in 2020 on election day. I know some polling doesn't really uphold that. It's kind of a mixed bag, but I do think Trump is more controversial than he was in 2020. And again, he would have only beat Joe Biden because Joe Biden got so much more unpopular compared to 2020. Anyways, independent voters are going to decide Pennsylvania. Harris and Biden well with them in 2020. I think Republicans have given us no reason to be confident that they are going to do well with independent voters this time around. And again, the geography of Pennsylvania is hard for Republicans. Trump did incredibly well in rural Pennsylvania in 2020. Let's make that very clear. Trump, this performance is nothing to be ashamed of for him from a pure electoral standpoint. He did very well in the rural areas, and he was actually able to improve in the city of Philadelphia. Still wasn't enough to win the state because the suburbs, which are growing, trended left. In 2022, they moved even more towards the Democrats. So in the era of Dobbs, in the year where Democrats and Kamala Harris have campaigned a lot on the extremism of Trump, whether or not they can sell that to voters, right? In the era of, what I would say is kind of a third Trump run that is, I think his campaign from this time around is certainly worse than 2016, maybe worse than 2020. I think that's going to hurt him with these moderate suburban voters. Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is, Democrats in 2022 knocked it out of the park there. I think this time around they're going to do it once again, and that's going to be enough to propel Harris to a very narrow victory in this state. I do want to note, let's go to the polls here. The polls show a very close race, but again, I think a lot of that is because of the these these Republican-leaning pollsters kind of coming in and flooding the zone, right? Trafalgar, Patriot Polling, Insider Advantage, Atlas Intel, these polls, they all have Trump ahead. They're all Republican-aligned. If we look at the higher quality pollsters, Emerson does have Trump up. I'll give him that. But New York Times, Siena, in their likely voter screen, they have a tie with a slight advantage to Harris. And then obviously FAU had Harris up by 2. We saw in the local pollsters, or actually before we go there, YouGov, which is a good poll, A-rated, they had Harris up by 3. DFP had Harris up by 2. Suffolk had a tie race. And then Muhlenberg, which is a local pollster that I like, they had Harris up by 2. And then Marist, this is one of my favorite pollsters, as I've already noted. They had Harris up by 2. Washington Post had her up by 1. So these polls all show close races, but the high-quality ones, they give it to Harris by a little bit, and that's enough to push me over the line here. I'm predicting Harris wins Pennsylvania by around a point like Biden did in 2020. Now, with that being said, I do want to talk about the state of Nevada. Nevada, John Ralston came out today and said Harris was going to win it by 0.3%. For the first time, I'm going to break with him. I think Trump's going to take Nevada by maybe 0.3%. I'll show you the final margin at the end of the video. But Nevada is going to be so close this year. But polls aside, because the polls have actually moved towards Harris in the past week, I'll admit that. Here's what I think about Nevada. Right now, per John Ralston himself, Donald Trump has a 30,000 vote lead going into Election Day. The majority of voting in Nevada is early voting. We know it's reported by registration. There's a lot of unaffiliated voters who are going to decide the state. But right now, Donald Trump has the lead. The question is, A, are there enough mail-in ballots left outstanding for Harris to win, right? Because mail-in ballots are going to skew Democratic. B, do those independent voters swing towards Harris? And in 2022, they helped Democrats because they voted for Catherine Cortez Masto over Adam Laxalt. Here's the issue, though, and this is where it gets really hard for Democrats. They need a turnout on Election Day that is simultaneously, higher than expected, but also more Democratic than expected. So they need to get their voters out in Clark County. Is it possible? Certainly. But historically, the Reid machine in Nevada that's been able to get Democrats wins is that they turn in their ballots before Election Day. So I don't know why it would change all of a sudden where Democrats are now going to vote, en masse on Election Day, right? It's definitely possible, and I think that the factor of independent voters could really help Democrats. But again, to me, it's just hard to pick the side that is losing right now, and that really at this point in time should be ahead and should be building up a firewall. And so, to me, Nevada, I have a lot of respect for John Ralston, what he does, and he usually can call Nevada quite well. So I'm taking a bit of a risk betting against him. But at this point, I'm going to take Trump to win Nevada. So with that, we're going to go to the state of, or actually we're going to go to Arizona first. So Arizona, staying in the Sun Belt here for a second. Arizona is going to be very interesting to watch. This is a state that I've long been confident Democrats in, and I still believe that there's a good chance they win. But the problem is the high-quality polling is just bad for Harris, and there's no way of getting around that. She's down by 2 points. This is her worst swing state by the polls, and it's consistent, right? Like, the only pollster that has her ahead is Focal Data, right? Everyone else has her behind. New York Times Siena has her down by 4. That's just too much for me to ignore. Arizona is a state that I think demographically Harris can do well in. We look at 2020, we see that Maricopa counties where Biden won the state, Harris is going to do well there this time, but the polling seems to be picking up on A, potentially her underperforming in Maricopa County by a little bit, which is obviously detrimental statewide, and B, losing support with Hispanic voters. Arizona is going to be very close this year. I wouldn't be shocked if Harris wins, and I think demographically it doesn't make a lot of sense that Republicans are doing so well this year, but at the same time, this is important. I'm not going to just go with my gut. I do believe the polls, and I believe that consistently that Trump has will translate on Election Day tomorrow, even if, and this is a big if, even if it's smaller than that 4-point margin that New York Times had it as. So with that, let's go over to the state of Wisconsin. This one, to me, is going to decide the election in my map. It's the tipping point, and Kamala Harris takes Wisconsin by the skin of her teeth. It's going to be so close. I think she is just slightly favored here. Trump could absolutely win it, and I would not be surprised at all if Trump does win Wisconsin. But let's talk about it. In the polls, the high-quality polls have been consistent. Harris is ahead, and she leads by a point even with a lot of GOP polls in the pool. Trafalgar, Patriot, Insider Advantage, Atlas Intel, these are all GOP firms. Even Trafalgar has Harris winning, which is interesting to me. Emerson has them tied. Let's go to the high-quality pollsters, the ones we like the most. New York Times Siena, when they push undecided voters, Harris is up by 2. Let's go to YouGov. Harris up by 4. Tip Insights, which is actually a pollster that, this year has been pretty bullish on Republicans compared to the consensus. Harris is up by 1 and 2 there. Marist, great Rust Belt pollster, they have Harris up by 2. That's enough for me to pull the trigger. But there's more. Early voting. We've seen good signs for both Republicans and Democrats. In the WAV counties, Republicans are turning out. These are their And, just to show you on a map here, these are their most important counties. Waukesha County's turning out, Washington's turning out, Ozark's turning out, but they all trended left in 2020 by significant amounts. So I think that could, partially be an important factor here is that these counties are trending left, and that might not be a great thing for Republicans. But most importantly, we know that Wisconsin Democrats do not always vote early. In 2022, we saw Democrats win the governorship here because they turned out in Madison on Election Day. And right now, even in the early voting, Milwaukee and Madison are turning out big for Democrats. They're above the statewide average, and that is making me comfortable in picking Harris here. They're kind of building up a firewall. What matters, the question to me becomes, does Dane County turn out on Election Day? This county is where Madison is. It's where the University of Wisconsin is. Biden won with 260,000 votes here. Harris is going to need to get more than that to win the state. Biden got 76% here. Democrats got 80% in the 2022 elections broadly. The question is, does Dane turn out? It's already been turning out in the early vote. I think it's going to turn out again this year, tomorrow, like it did in 2022. And again, Democrats in Wisconsin have had a really robust ground game. They've won the key races here in 2018. They did it in 2020. And they did it in 2022. And again, I know they lost that Senate race by a point, but the National Democrats gave up on it 2 months prior. And most people thought Barnes was going to lose by 4 or 5, and he lost by 1, in part because Wisconsin Democrats have been winning, the persuasion battle and the turnout battle for the past few cycles. It's going to be unbelievably close. Again, I wouldn't be shocked at all if Trump takes it, but I think Wisconsin at this point puts Kamala Harris above 270. So the final state is Georgia, and I'll be honest, Georgia is the state that I went back and forth the most on because, of course, it's going to be so close. I think it's going to be one of the closest states, either Georgia or Arizona, potentially, in terms of just that raw vote margin, right? Now, I ended up doing a lot of math on Georgia, and I generally actually like to avoid math in my final predictions. I do the math a week beforehand, and I don't do it with the early vote. But in Georgia, I just had to. So let's talk about Georgia. At this point in time, you've got an electorate that is 26.4% black and 58% white. And then you also have Hispanic and Asian voters at around 3% each. So what does that mean? On the surface, I think this is below average for Harris. In 2020, we saw that the electorate, and this is down to the percentage point, the electorate in the early vote was 27.8% black. So that means that this electorate of 2024 early vote is 1.4% less black than the 2020 electorate. That's a problem for Democrats. They need black turnout to win Georgia. Black voters, I think Democrats have black voters to thank for the fact that they've done well in Georgia in the past few cycles. But the interesting thing here is that if we take a look at the congressional districts that are returning their ballots, Republicans are turning out to vote early. And again, what we saw in 2020 was a similar thing. The electorate was 27.8% black, but what we did see was that the 4th and 5th district, which are both deep blue Atlanta seats, were the lowest in terms of turnout. And Joe Biden still won the state because those districts did turn out on Election Day, which ended up literally giving Biden the state. This time, it's similar. The two lowest, or 2 of the 3 lowest counties or districts with the lowest turnout, the Georgia 4 and Georgia 5, again, deep blue Atlanta seats. Only this time, it's actually more likely to vote on Election Day. We've got polling data that suggests Democrats this year are more likely to vote on Election Day. We know that a bunch of early voters, especially in Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, on the Republican side, actually did vote in person on Election Day in 2020. So the early voting electorate is obviously more Republican, but Democrats still have room to grow. And we can kind of actually already see this. The reddest district in Georgia, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat, is the highest in turnout, and Democrats are still, I think they're barely afloat here right now. I calculated, and if you give Kamala Harris and Donald Trump their respective shares of each of these demographics per their polling averages, so let's say Harris wins 31% of white voters, but 89% of black voters, right? She'd be winning Georgia right now by around 4 points. The question becomes, is there enough election day turnout for Trump to overcome that? It's a small number. 4% is not too much to overcome for Trump on Election Day. That's why it's so close. But at the end of the day, the fact that we know a lot of these communities that are more Democratic leaning, especially in Atlanta, are likely to turn out on Election Day and not vote early, the fact that Republicans have already banked in a lot of their votes they'd be getting otherwise, that makes me a little skeptical. I do think Trump can win Georgia. It's going to be unbelievably close. And I know I've been saying that about so many of the races, but it truly is. But at this point, I'm going to flip Georgia back to the Democratic column. We've also seen in the final polls a bit of movement towards Kamala Harris. She was down really, I think, by a good amount at the end of October. She was down by almost 2%. Even in the middle of the month, it's now down to a 1-point lead for Trump, so that lead has been halved. And we got some good polls that show a close race here. New York Times CNN, their final poll, they've had Trump up in Georgia all cycle. The final poll, they have Harris up by 1. Again, we go to ECU, another good pollster. They have a tied race. YouGov did have Trump up by 2, but DFP had Harris up by 1. So it's gone from a consistent Trump lead, right? Like as we saw in mid-October. Now in the final days of the campaign, Harris is closing strong here. And I also want to talk about the geography, because these suburbs have just been so bad for Republicans. You go to Atlanta, and the majority of the electorate is going to come from the Atlanta metro area. These counties swung towards Joe Biden by a lot in 2020. And again, even if Kamala Harris doesn't get these same swings, it's still going to be hard for Trump to win Georgia if she can do 5-6% better in all these counties, which did trend left in 2022 once again. We also have to talk about the fact that I think the Democrats are going to raise the salience of the abortion issue here on Election Day, right? Georgia, in those suburbs, you do have a lot of pro-choice voters who maybe are moderate but broke, are starting to break away from the Republican Party. You also have a lot of people who've moved in the past 4 years, maybe to Atlanta. They're young voters. They have college degrees. They're going to skew Democratic. The demographics in Georgia are changing, and that obviously benefits the Democratic Party as well. So that is my final prediction. Kamala Harris is going to take 280, or is predicted to take 286 electoral votes. Trump 252. Again, just to kind of go over the states here, I have Harris narrowly favored in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and Georgia. These states are going to be very close, especially, I think, Georgia. But as of right now, the analysis I've done leads me to predict a narrow Harris victory. And then Trump, he's going to win Arizona, he's going to win North Carolina, and then Nevada, I do have him narrowly taken, although that one's going to be very close as well. So that is the final prediction. I'll show the margins now. Again, as you can see here, I do release margins fully. And the closest states, as I've already talked about, are going to be Arizona. They're going to be Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada. So that's kind of what it is. I do predict the popular vote just for fun. Doesn't really matter, obviously, but I have Harris winning it by, I think, 3.4%. And that is a bit of a swing towards Trump from 2020, but I think a lot of those gains are going to come from California, Florida, New York, maybe the more safe states in the country. But at the same time, he's going to do maybe the same or worse in the swing states, and that's what's going to cost him. So that's the final map. Again, we'll be getting results tomorrow, and around 24 hours from now. I'm posting this at around, I think, 5:30 or 6 p.m. Eastern time the night before. So this is me logging it in. So I'll see you guys all on the other side, and we'll see how this prediction turned out. So thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'll see you all tomorrow.